my name is Peter Urwin. I'm a Principal Investigator for this Skilled Managers Productive Workplaces project, or SMPW as we call it for short. Today we're going to share findings to date from the project. We hope you'll find these interesting, but also there's a kind of ask from you, which is that we hope you can give us some kind of insights into your own experiences and perhaps help us to overcome some of the challenges that we've faced over the last couple of years, and also some of the ones that we're continuing to face. My colleague Paul Latreille will start with a brief history, origin story, so to speak, an overview of the training intervention. Richard Saundry is then going to set out his work developing and beta testing the intervention with organisations and sharing some key insights. I think this will be, perhaps for most people in the audience, the kind of most interesting part. I'll then share some findings from an initial pilot of the full randomised controlled trial. I'll perhaps be a little bit rude now and again, trying if we start to kind of talk too much, because all of us want to have a little bit of time at the end to have discussion and get your feedback. So in the interest of that, I also might cut my bit a bit short, because I think the main points of interest are from Richard. So with that, Richard, do you want to just go to the next screen for me, please? Cheers. So just to give you a brief overview of what we're trying to achieve before Paul goes through things. Essentially, the intervention or the project tries to evaluate the impact of line manager competence in conflict resolution and its impact on measures of workplace productivity. That's the kind of start of from my perspective, start of the causal chain and the end of the causal chain. Does the training that develops conflict competence have an impact on the bottom line? Within that, we've got a variety of aims. So Rich is going to talk to you about how he devised and implemented with our colleagues ACAS and many other stakeholders, how he designed the intervention. Then we're going to talk a little bit about the initial indications of our approach to evaluating the impact of this training on that conflict competence, employee engagement, and then finally measures of workplace productivity and our approach to try and identify those various parts in the relationship. And we've got a particular focus on trying to think about how conflict competence and actual management practice relate to employee engagement. And finally, the idea of the project really is to come up with something that's practicable and can be replicated in other settings. So that's my brief introduction. Richard, would you like to go to the next slide, and then Paul can take over?
Thanks, Pete. Yeah, so I'm just going to give a brief overview of the history of the project, and I guess in that sense we have evolution but also revolution. So the history kind of goes back to 2019 when we were originally devising the training, something that we undertook in conjunction with ACAS, with a plan to develop a one-day face-to-face training intervention. And the way we developed that was initially to go through all of the ACAS training products and identify the elements that we thought needed to be migrated into what we were doing. We then ran a series of ACAS workshops with ACAS practitioners, ACAS advisors, in order to work out what needed to be in that core one-day training intervention. Having done that with workshops in Manchester, Leeds and London, we also had a series of conversations with practitioners, HR practitioners and key stakeholders, including trade union officials, lawyers and so on, to try and arrive at what we thought was the training that we really ought to put in front of line managers. Having done that and having developed that training on a co-design type basis, we then went into a proof of concept event. The first proof of concept event we had with Critical Friends was undertaken down in the southwest. We had positive feedback from that suggested we were doing the right sorts of things. And so we then scheduled a second proof of concept event, which was co-hosted with ACAS and scheduled for the 2nd of April 2020. As you can imagine, that was about a fortnight after the first lockdown began. And so everything basically went into pause because of COVID. We had an extended period while we waited to see how COVID played out. I think many people thought that COVID was going to be over quite quickly and we'd be able to go back to delivering this face-to-face training intervention. I should add, delivered by ACAS advisors. But it became clear in the early part of the summer that this wasn't going to be something that happened quickly. So we just took a decision that we needed to pivot this to online delivery. Something that I think was also influenced on our side by the fact that ACAS, were not doing face-to-face training. And in fact, they didn't do face-to-face training, as I understand it, for around a year because of the various COVID lockdowns and so on. So we just took a decision to pivot to online delivery, partly to do with the uncertainty around COVID, the restrictions on face-to-face meetings, and indeed perceptions about what we thought would happen in the longer term. So Richard, if you can just go to the next slide, please. So we went through a series of phases when we were developing this online intervention. I think it's worth emphasising just what a major shift that was from where we were originally. When we first developed this, as I say, we developed the training with ACAS as being a one-day face-to-face intervention, a workshop type format. The shift to online had to be done at speed. We had very limited budgets for doing this because it wasn't costed in the original budget, funding from the ESRC. So we had to do this at pace. We had to do it with limited budgets, and it was a complete shift from the way we'd anticipated doing this. So not only were we moving the research element of this online, we were also moving the training intervention itself, and that required a fundamental rethink of the way in which we undertook the training itself. The first of the steps that we went through was to identify a platform to host the content, and our virtual learning environment, the one that we went for, was a new Spring, which offered a range of affordances for us. It's got a modern interface. You'll see a couple of screenshots a bit later. It enables us, it's SCORM compliant. It enables us to host various types of content, to run meetings within the training platform itself, or to migrate in from other platforms like Zoom. So it had a range of really good things that helped us do what we felt we needed to do in an online delivery mode. We developed then the materials for online delivery, and we've got a range of different materials, as you'll see, including things like podcasts developed with ACAS, video content, which we're currently in a process of refreshing, a toolkit of resources for managers to go back to at the end of the training and be able to deploy on an on-demand basis when they get into a situation that they need those tools. In the same way as we did with the face-to-face intervention, we did some proof of concept trial. And there were really two stages to that. First thing was to put the training in front of ACAS advisors and a series of critical friends. Subsequently, we went through various kind of evolutionary phases, redeveloping the material. It became clear that one of the affordances of moving online was that we were able to bespoke the material in ways that weren't necessarily possible with face-to-face delivery. We gradually moved towards a more sectoral focus on sectors such as health, social care, retail and hospitality. And also a focus in more recent times on SMEs and micro businesses. We then went through some beta testing. So we did one face-to-face beta testing where we trialled the content with individuals in the Southwest. Individuals in an organisation in the Southwest. We then had 4 online organisations that we went through beta testing with, where they actually put a group of managers into the platform. We signed them up, gave them licenses. They got online and were able to test out the platform. And Richard will talk about that in a moment, the results basically of the 4 online organisations that came into the online beta testing. In total, we've had 150 stakeholders enrolled on the platform. That includes ACAS advisors, it includes critical friends, it includes individuals who wanted to look at this. We've actually also been able to enroll individuals who want to see what the training looks like on a kind of look before you buy basis, as it were. Although I should emphasise the training is free to participating organisations, at least within the research component of the project. we'll talk a little bit more about that in just a second. We've had 82 managers who participated across the 4 online organisations who've done this online. And I mentioned about kind of free to users. One of the early indications was that many organisations were happy to do the kind of the online training element free for a subgroup of their managers, but bigger organisations didn't want to just train those managers. They wanted to train a much wider group of managers. And so it's become evident that alongside the research component, we also need a commercial offer that enables organisations to train all of their managers. So they get a certain number for free with research, and then they can come in and they can buy additional licenses to train the remainder of their offer, or the remainder of their staff. So we think that makes for a very attractive offer. Okay, Richard, if you can go forward one more slide, please. So just to give you a very quick flavour of the training, it's broken down into 4 main modules. So 1 on effective communication, 1 on feedback and difficult conversations, 1 on managing conflict, and 1 on conflict resolution. Within the first of those, there's focus, for example, on things like questioning and listening skills. The feedback and difficult conversations focuses mainly on managing performance and how to give effective feedback. The managing conflict module focuses on when and how to intervene in situations that might arise in the workplace and decision making. And the last of those introduces a process for the managers to resolve conflict with staff or indeed among staff. The key features of the training, which, as I say, have evolved throughout the development phases of the training, and we were developing as we went through each of the beta stage online testing, is we have a pre and post diagnostic for managers on their conflict handling styles, which we think is one of the ways in which we can test whether the training's having an effect. We have tests of their skills, for example, using simulations. We've got videos and podcasts, as I've already suggested. Each of the modules has a section on key learning points and an opportunity for managers to reflect. And we have this toolkit, a toolkit of resources that includes things like, conversation planner, open, closed, and indeed probing questions, etc., etc. So we've got a series of resources there that managers can come back to after the training when they need to access them. And we have typically had webinars at the top and tail of each of the training courses, but we also recently have introduced bookable 15-minute one-to-one consultations for managers so they can get feedback from a member of the team. So we've got a lot of different resources there that we think makes this an attractive offer, and it can be delivered very flexibly. So we can deliver the training synchronously, and we've done that in one of the beta testing phases. We could do it asynchronously, so managers just come in and they just go straight into the resources and work their way through, or we can do things bichronously. That is a mix of synchronous and asynchronous. So you might have a webinar at the beginning and the end, and then the managers work through the online training on an asynchronous basis in between. So we've got very flexible delivery. And Richard's going to talk now about the 4 organisations that were part of the beta testing and some findings from what we got when we did that.
Thanks, Paul. Yeah, so Paul's given a very, very thorough and effective description of how we've developed the training itself and the toolkit and the intervention as a whole. I'm going to just talk briefly about the beta testing we did with a number of organisations. So this was done probably over a period of about 4 or 5 months in the sort of middle to end of last year. As Paul mentioned, we did that with 4 organisations that involved 82 managerial delegates. And those organisations were not necessarily selected particularly for the sectors they were in. They were selected because they were the organisations that we were able to recruit at that particular time. So there's an element of convenient sampling about this, so that needs to be borne in mind. However, each of them provided some really different challenges that we'll look at. The first organisation was an organisation in the civil service with 7,000 plus employees, multiple sites, operating in a highly pressured environment, particularly at the time in which the trial took place. That particular model was run on the basis of a one-day synchronous delivery for 24 delegates in one unit. So we literally sat there with, I was on my computer in my home, they were in the office, 24 people sat at their computers doing the course at exactly the same time. So the equivalent of a one-day training course, but online. And we'll talk about some of the implications of that later. The second organisation was a large NHS trust, again operating under really, really high pressure, 12,000 plus employees, multiple sites. That we delivered that slightly differently. So we delivered that across a sort of 3.5 week period for 20 managers in 2 cohorts drawn from specific groups within the trust. And that was all, as Paul mentioned, that was top and tail with a webinar at the beginning and then a webinar at the end of the course. That particular organisation, just to give you a flavour of the sorts of challenges we were dealing with, when we had the first webinar, for example, I was confronted with the delegates largely dressed in sort of PPE. So these were people literally off the ward, doing training online, or trying to engage with our training intervention. So again, operating under a really, really pressured situation, which is, we'll point out later, is one of the key target areas for the project as it develops. The third organisation was a private transport organisation, and that was delivered over a 4-week period with 23 delegates, a single cohort, and I'll talk a little bit about that later. The fourth organisation was a public sector regulatory body with 250 plus employees. Again, we did that with a webinar at the beginning, webinar at the end, and the delegates had around 5 weeks to complete the training. Importantly, within organisational 4 was the one organisation where where we delivered it asynchronously. However, they were given dedicated time in which to undertake the training, which we'll come back later as a key issue within this. We collected data from the NewSpring platform. One of the benefits of online delivery is that it provides with a whole range of data collection opportunities, which we just don't have when delivering face-to-face. When we were designing the project originally, we were going to have observations, etc. But for example, it's very difficult to see how long an individual is taking to perform a certain exercise, etc. We can do all that so that we can look at completion rates, activities undertaken, the duration of each activity, test scores, responses to quizzes, plus open-ended feedback questions, which were obviously very important for us in this phase, because we really wanted to see how these managers were going to react to this training. One key problem here is the reluctance of managers to engage, particularly with this type of training focusing on conflict resolution. Okie dokie. So here's some sort of descriptive statistics, which given the numbers, we have to be very careful about this, but I think it does throw out some really quite interesting suggestions and indications and insights, particularly as we move forward within the project. You'll notice that organisation 3 is not here, and there's a reason for that, and that's because organisation 3, we had our webinar to start the training. It was the one trial which really just didn't work in terms of manager engagement. Again, an organisation working under a significant amount of pressure, managers dealing with a whole range of different challenges. However, there was very, very little engagement, to the point where there was not enough data really to report here. Nonetheless, it was quite a useful experience in terms of really showing the challenges that we had in terms of getting managers to engage. So the data I'm going to talk about is drawn from the organisations 1, 2 and 4, which were the three largest organisations in our initial beta sample. This is the first figure here is on completion rates, and you can see organisation 1 for fairly high completion rates, both average and median statistics there. And that's because they were there. They were sat in a room. They had to do the training. So essentially, there was a degree of compulsion. They were all given the day off to do the training, and they sat there and did it together. So we would expect high completion rates. Organisation 2, which was the NHS Trust, completion rates were far lower. And I think the key point here is that feedback we got from Organisation 2 was that there was very little in the way of dedicated time provided for them to do the training. Basically, the managers were expected to manage their own time and include the training within that. And for some of those managers, it simply was not a priority. They were dealing with clinical priorities. They were dealing with patients. They were dealing with very challenging situations. One of the participating managers in the end of course webinar explained that they were unable to do the just find time for the training simply due to the volume of work. And before that webinar, they'd had to do a double shift on the ward. They were a manager, because of staff shortages, they were having to actually fill in. And they just simply didn't have the time given the amount of pressure. So we have much lower or significantly lower completion rates in Organisation 2. Organisation 4 was slightly different because, again, they completed over a period of time, as with Organisation 2. There were perhaps three key things about Organisation 4, and that is that, one, they were expected to do this and they were provided with some time. So within their workload, they were given some time in order to do this. Secondly, they were an organisation where they were already working remotely. So the managers were already working from home, they were working on their laptops, and I think that certainly had an impact in terms of them completing an online course, as opposed to a clinician in the NHS who's having to simply literally drop what they're doing to perhaps then engage in the training while at work, or alternatively get home at the end of a long shift and then do an hour's work on an online training course. That's going to be much more challenging. The third thing was, one of the interesting things is that the training and HR department were much more involved. So they did the training alongside the managers. So although there wasn't any surveillance as such, there was a sense that, again, adding to that sense of expectation. So again, sort of arm's length compulsion, if you like, for Organisation 4, but extremely high completion rates in that case. We looked at duration. That's one of the things we can do, so we can see how long it took for people to do the course. Organisation 1, about 3.5 hours. Organisation 2, similarly. Organisation 4 was quite interesting because actually what we had was a big difference between average and median. And that's because some people took a long time. And one of the things about the course is that it's layered so that individuals, if they want to delve into, for example, the podcast series, they can do that. So an individual can complete the course in, say, 2.5 hours, but they could take 9 or 10 hours exploring all the resources. And in Organisation 4, there was some evidence that that was the case, and that's what learners were doing. Okay. Activity duration was fairly similar. So there wasn't a great deal of difference around that. And one of the interesting things that we found was that there was a little bit of drop off as the course went on, as you would expect perhaps, but it wasn't as much as we thought. So one thing that wasn't happening was that individuals were, if you like, their engagement levels were dropping very, very quickly as they went through the course. So those people who stuck with the course tended to give those activities the sorts of time and attention that we were looking for, or that's what the data tends to suggest. We thought there might be some real drop-off points or elements where people were, for example, skipping through. We were able to see that wasn't the case. So those people who were engaged initially tended to work their way through the course and tended to devote time and attention on those various elements. That does have some implications, which we'll get to later, in that I think one of the issues that we're still struggling with a little bit here is that individuals, there's a sense from the data that we've got so far that those people really completing and engaging are those managers who perhaps are interested, those managers who might have higher levels of skill in the first place, and perhaps aren't really the managers we want to get to. So that's, again, one of the challenges that we're grappling with at the moment. One of the things that we did in the in the beta testing is we did tests, pre-course and post-course tests. So in the beta version, and we changed this in the version that Peter's going to be talking about in a second, we actually had designed a test of conflict competence, so that we actually gave people a scenario and asked them a range of questions. One of the things that we noted was that the scores generally were fairly high, so the variation was not as much as we would have liked, and for that reason we've subsequently changed how we've tested for this. However, even with that, we did see a improvement in test scores. So this is the sort of percentage improvement in test scores. And in each of the three organisations for which we have meaningful data, we did see a notable increase in the improvement in test scores post-course as opposed to pre-course. And particularly, I think the interesting thing here is the difference between organisation 1 and organisation 4. Organisation 1, as we mentioned, was synchronous. There was a degree of compulsion. And our own observations from that training was that while some of the managers were really quite engaged, others were slightly coasting through the training, as one tends to get on a one-day training course, generally when it's face-to-face, as somebody who's delivered some of these things. With organisation 4, where there was that expectation of completion, where the managers were used to working online and where there was a greater engagement perhaps from the organisation itself, we saw a greater improvement in terms of the post and pre-test scores. And again, given the numbers, we can't read too much into this, but there's a little bit of indication there that perhaps the impact of the course may well be related to the sense in which people engage and complete, rather than the amount of time spent. The average time spent by individual, the median time spent for individuals in organisation 4 was the lowest of those three. So that's an interesting, I think, an interesting thing to think about in itself. But that certainly gave us some encouragement in terms of that perhaps, you know, we're onto something in terms of creating some degree of impact. One of the things we wanted to get back from the managers was what they actually thought of this training. We were worried, if I'm to be frank, that a lot of the managers may be very resistant to the platform, to the online nature of training, particularly as I would say in 2 of the 4 organisations, we were talking about managers from quite traditional backgrounds. And certainly in the initial webinars, there was some concern about, well, I don't really like online learning. I'm not sure about how it's all work. The reality was the feedback that we've had from those managers who've completed the course, or at least completed the majority of the course, has been uniformly positive. And I think that's quite interesting in itself. So there's a few quotes there. I won't bother reading those out. You can read them for yourselves. But we got some real positive feedback. I think people enjoyed the platform. They enjoyed the materials. They enjoyed the interactivity. They enjoyed, in some respects, the fact that we're not trying to overcomplicate this. So a quote from one manager is that they really enjoyed the fact they could do this when they wanted to, and that, in their words, didn't have the normal waffle, i.e. the idea behind the philosophy behind the intervention is not to provide a leadership management training program. It's to provide very concrete advice for managers that's easy to understand and hopefully relatively easy to apply. And certainly that's the feedback we've been getting from managers. Certainly, as I've sort of hinted at, one of the key things is issues of engagement. So I think the relationship between the commitment of the organisation time to complete is absolutely key, I think, for us. And I think it's difficult to move away from the idea that compulsion is really important here. And certainly, although one needs to think about how the tension between compulsion and quality of engagement, the reality is, however, is that hard-pressed managers, if they're particularly those people who might be reluctant trainers, are going to do this, there needs to be a degree of compulsion in our view. And I think, and that'd be something interesting to discuss if we've got a little bit of time later. I think compulsion is an element which we just can't avoid. And finally, in terms of the impact of sort of like the mode of delivery. So one of the things that came out of the training was that we had lots of opportunities for interaction and discussion boards. We monitored those. We tried to facilitate them. There was relatively limited use of some of those things, which some of us who've been involved with using them in academic context will be possibly quite familiar with. Most of the managers looked at this in quite an instrumental way. They wanted to use it to help them to manage difficult situations. The extent to which they wanted a sort of a discussion about the philosophy of this in this particular intervention, I think certainly that didn't necessarily come out of the beta testing phase. There were a few measurement issues. So the test that we had initially, users scored very highly to begin with, and there was less variation than we would have liked. And I think the reason for that was that they were closed questions and they were relatively easy to game. So I think the points we made earlier about the test scores we need to think about, and we have changed that, as Peter will explain a little bit, or I'll explain in a second. I think what it did show is some real benefits. So firstly, scalability. We can reach far more managers doing this, if successful, than we could with face-to-face training. Much greater flexibility, and that certainly came back in the feedback. We can do a whole number of things which we can't do face-to-face. So tests, we can use scenarios much more easily. We can use simulations. We can't really do things like role play, and that's an issue which might be interesting to discuss. But we can also create much more permanent online resources. So a lot of our focus is going into creating and improving and refining what Paul referred to as our toolkit, which we see as being very important in relation to longer term impact. And we can also, but we can track learner engagement. So rather than doing a course, getting our happy sheets back and thinking everybody loved it, we can actually track whether people are really engaging with this. And that is, I think, really important, particularly from a research point of view, but also from an impact perspective. Those are just a few screenshots to show what the training looks like. But we've done a number of things to develop it into the version of the training and toolkit, which is going to go into the randomized controlled trial phase, the main stage of the research. Firstly, a focus on hard to reach managers, because we think that is where this particular intervention may have maximized its impact. Secondly, we've made it more streamlined and smartphone compatible, and that's come out of a demand from organizations. So now I would say people can do this in an hour and a half, 2 hours. They can do everything by phone as opposed to just necessarily through a laptop. We've changed our pre and post course tests. So we're now tracking conflict management style, and that seems to be working much better from our initial results. As Paul mentioned, we've introduced one-to-one video coaching, and again, people are making some use of that. And again, that seems to be something which is being valued. And finally, we're redesigning the toolkit as a result of some of the feedback from the first phase. Okay, so I'll now hand over to Pete, who's just going to take us through the most recent stage where we've started to pilot the actual RCT itself.
Okay, so with time in mind, relatively quickly, basically the pilot is to just test the mechanics for the evaluation. I'll kind of explain or give you an idea of what the cluster RCT means. Particularly for hard to reach managers, as Richard says, we've kind of focused down more and more on a group of managers that we feel are not well served for management training. They're particularly located in hospitality, retail, business admin and social care. Health is a slight exception to that in some ways, because what we're thinking is we are focusing on our areas which have got temporary and 0 hours contracts, high staff turnover, which could apply to health, early career workers, often with lower skill levels and wages, and long and irregular hours. So we kind of, as we've developed the intervention, we've pared it down a lot more and really made it so that it is very, what we were increasingly calling light touch. The realities are that if you do that, you are dealing with individuals who are employees or managers who haven't got contact details or emails, or high turnover means that their contact details are out of date. The employees tend to be less engaged, if you think of bar staff and so on, just generally less engaged with the job that they're doing, or that stage in their lives is that work and their job is not the main thing in their lives. So the idea is that we've got to have surveys that are very short, mobile compatible. The training's got to be shorter. That's definitely been the focus, making it, as Richard said, really kind of, these are the key things. There's no waffle, as he was kind of suggesting. Asynchronous, so you say, okay, you've got a month to do this, off you go, you try and fit it in as around your shifts or your other work patterns. But that then gives us this problem or this concern, especially in these areas at the moment, that the company concerns of retention often trump concerns over training uptake. So they don't want to start hassling the chef and saying, why haven't you done the training? Because the chef might turn around and go, right, that was the straw, and I know I'm off. So they're concerned about that. So just to pick up one thing in chat, I noticed Lisa put in something about having a certificate. So there's been lots of discussion about certificates and engagement and so on and so forth. But we've got rid of, ultimately a certificate and qualification would be nice, but that's not where we've gone. We've gone for, this is something that gives you the skills you need for the job. There's a certificate there of some sorts, but we've not gone down that route of making it more like a formal course where you get some kind of qualification. So next slide, Richard. So just to give you an idea of what we mean by cluster RCT. So essentially, we've piloted, so just before we start, and the 77 managers / supervisors underlined is there's a reason for that. So ultimately with the pilot, what we also wanted to do was go out and try and pilot the randomization element, but really letting the company not dictate the terms of that, but for the pilot to say, okay, for instance, there was a discussion of how many managers and supervisors do you want to train? And we went with the company. We said, okay, we're not going to dictate that. We're going to let you choose, and we'll learn from that experience. We've learned from that experience that if you let the company choose, they choose too many managers and supervisors, or that's the case here. 77 managers for 160 staff is a bit ridiculous. So we will now be a little more restrictive. I think this is possibly one of the reasons why we've got poor uptake in the for the training in this particular pilot, although I'll come to those numbers in a bit. So that's one of the lessons is, yeah, we're going to be a bit more restrictive on what we allow to be considered as a manager or a supervisor. But that gives you an idea of what we were trying to do with the pilot, which is to say, okay, we need to randomize, we need to choose units randomly to be treated and units to not get the intervention, and then record some kind of impact on employees and also the behavior of managers or the perceived change in behaviors of managers. But ultimately doing that very much with a kind of, what does the company want to get out of it, so that we have something that at least we know what is attractive to a company. And then if we push back a bit on that for the main stage, we know what we're sacrificing. So this was a hotel and catering SME with 160 staff, too many managers and supervisors trained or in scope to be trained. There are 4 units. So a cluster RCT is basically that you randomize at the level of the unit. The idea is you don't want manager 1 trained and manager 2 not trained, and basically they talk to each other, they share the learning, and you don't have a clear distinction between your treatment and control group. So ultimately in November, we randomly selected unit 1 to receive the training. There's about 15 managers in that unit. There's a bit of a delay for Omicron. We went with a pulse survey. So essentially this is a people survey across all 160 staff to take a benchmark starting point across the treated and control units. And then January to March, the training was undertaken for the treated managers in Unit 1, and then you take another people survey pulse across all employees to see how things have changed between the treated and control units. And then, strictly speaking, this is what we call a waitlisted RCT, cluster RCT, where with SMEs, we are also then training the second wave or the managers who were not included, or the units that were not included in the initial randomisation. I'll be happy to answer questions on that later, but ultimately for the larger organisations, as Paul has already alluded to, we can't within budget do that. So ultimately that is a more straightforward for larger organisations, ran treatment and control, and then if they want to train the rest of their managers, we will have a commercial offer to allow them to do that. And then we take a pulse right at the end. Okay, Paul, Richard, do you want to go to the next one? So, pulse survey. I've looked through various people surveys, each one no less than 50 odd questions from what I can see. We just can't do that. Bar staff under the age of 25, I definitely wouldn't have answered such a long survey. So when I was working in pubs, so we've got 10 questions and they are basically answered on a mobile phone. And as a result of that, I was very pleased with, this is the good news story. In the first wave across the treated control group, we had 90 responses, including 22 from the treated unit. Second wave, not so good, but these are just the questions. I'm not going to give a detailed indication of these. We can come back and discuss these. Ultimately, difficult decisions have to be made here. We cannot include the classic people survey indicators. We've pared them down. Any comments that people have got where they think that we've got a particularly egregious kind of omission would be very much appreciated. Hopefully nobody's going to say that, but I'm sure they will. Next one, Richard. Cheers. So just to give you an idea, I'm sure this is pretty standard stuff in terms of employees' views of the organisation are generally positive, just from that wave one responses. They consider, for instance, that they would recommend the place to friends and family. They consider that diversity is respected. Views on the job are not so positive in these contexts. Only 58% not thinking of leaving, which seems relatively low. 35% regularly experience stress that impacts their health and well-being. Relations with managers generally quite good, or generally good. 82% agree, but only 40% agree that poor performance is tackled, and 55% agree that the manager tackles conflict effectively. So I think that's kind of quite a usual kind of indicator within these high stress workplaces. Next one, Richard. Sorry to go through these quickly, but I do want to definitely leave enough time for. Let's skip this one. This is just a bit of the mechanics of doing those kind of wave one, wave two surveys, which a bit, yeah, the mechanics of it. So let's skip that one. There's no need to do that. So just very briefly, the training, the take up from training in wave one of the pilot is pretty poor. It's only 8 out of 15 managers were registered. So we essentially send the codes to the company. They correspond with the managers and share the codes and share the instructions on how to register and so on and so forth. And only 8 of the 15 who were corresponded with actually took up or registered. Only 3 fully completed and 2 failed to complete any activities. So we're not going to spend a lot of time talking about, or any time really, talking about the detail of that because the numbers are low. I mean, the numbers are quite low across the board at the moment because it is still in development stage. But ultimately here, the lesson is we need to do something about compulsion. So ultimately, tackling dropout, you know, we've got classic dropout here for those who are aware of RCTs. So pipeline to main stage, essentially for the main stage, we're going to have only engage with organisations that agree to push the training as mandatory. Obviously, we can't push the research as mandatory. And then correspondence between the team and the organisation to try and continue to gently push managers towards that, or even perhaps a bit more kind of harsh in that respect. But also, you know, there's as I said, we've got to make a clear distinction between a company that makes the training mandatory and our voluntary research engagement. Okay, this just gives you an idea of what the scores before and after give. As I say, the numbers are very low, but this, so don't kind of take too much notice of the actual numbers. But ultimately, for me, this gives a nice indication of, and just to answer one of the questions, it's when the training starts and ends. So this gives you an idea of how somebody's kind of approach to conflict changes over the period of the training. We've then got a long period where they can use a toolkit. They can also engage with employees, and we might want to follow up after that, but I'm not sure things would change too much. So this is just for the treated managers. We capture these scores. Right, Richard, I think next one, and I think we've got the discussion. Jolly good. So we've got significant barriers to training managers: time, organisational commitment, and individual motivation. We've kind of been daft and tried to focus on the sectors where this is even more of an issue, partly because we think that there is a literature which suggests that these areas are not well served, that these individuals are not well served, and there could be a real productivity impact. But if we're doing that, we've got to do it very light touch, and it's got to be very easy to access. And we can't also have lots of, in here, there is evidence of demand for this flexible, accessible training, but we can't give long pulse questionnaires. We can't have very intrusive research investigation approaches. So we've got to do something that's very light touch. So this does limit the research to some extent. We've also got, which I saw somebody was asking about, the one-to-ones. We've got a balance between training and bespoke advice. So whilst we call the one-to-ones coaching, in fact, Richard can add to this in a sec. I see them more as kind of on-demand support when somebody needs a bit of help, but we'll come back to that. Early tentative signs of intervention encourages and embeds proactive collaborative attitudes. I think it's stronger than that. I would say that the beta testing was really well received for those who do engage. Compulsion into and through the SMPGW, so getting managers on, but then also thinking about how we make sure that they complete is something that we're thinking about, and we do need to capture some organisational metrics. Richard, in fact, we've got 10 minutes left. Let's, if you keep the discussion points up for now, we can come back for next steps. Right. Daria, how do you want to deal with questions?
I have a few that I think haven't been
cool.
asked, haven't answered. I have one from Vicky Houghton. Did you use any gamification concepts for the online training to increase motivation? It will be interesting to see what was the impact in terms of behavioral change, and how the managers use the skills.
Could I? Yeah,
go ahead, mate.
So I should have mentioned, so for organisation 4, which probably had the sort of the strongest results in the beta testing, we did use quite a bit of gamification in terms of trying to get them to encourage to complete. So they could only unlock the next set of resources if they completed a block, and that was really successful. So that's something we're going to use going forward into the next main stage. In terms of behavioural change, so again, within the main stage, we're going to do some interviews up front with the organisation and then track that a little bit. I think our big area of interest is to see whether managerial behaviours translates into the views of their staff and the experiences of their staff. One of the key things from the RCT trial that Pete was talking about is the fact that you'll notice that most people like their managers, but then the results in terms of whether they're satisfied about whether issues are addressed and managed properly are much, much less positive. And there's a nice correlation between that and the conflict management styles. So the dominant conflict management styles before the training of those managers in the organization tend to be around accommodation or avoidance. So, and that goes with people liking their manager. The managers are nice, they're trying to keep people in the organization, but what they're probably not doing is addressing issues, which obviously is crucial to conflict management.
Yeah, so just to add a little bit to that. So the gamification bit, we had lots of scenarios in there where people were kind of, yeah, it was kind of game, but they kind of gamed it in terms of, it was quite obvious to lots of people, even if they weren't particularly great at conflict resolution, what they needed to do. So it would be nice to have a bit more in that. In terms of capturing behavioural change, we are limited in what we're going to collect in terms of, you know, changes in management practice, and it will mainly be from the, in a quantitative sense, from the employee perspective. Just to pick up on a couple of the other ones, is it possible to, so we could, yeah, any other comments on the 10 questions would be very much appreciated. Would we like more time between the training units 1 and then 2 and 3? Yes, but ultimately companies will not do that. They will not say, yeah, we'll train half of our managers and then 7 months later we'll train the other half. It just doesn't work. So it just doesn't work as an offer. So ultimately, we are trying to extend that as far as we can, but ultimately we are limited. Again, it's trying to get that space where we've got something that's you know, robust in terms of research approach, but also is attractive to companies, because we've got to have something that is they are interested in taking up. Does anybody else? Paul, do you want to answer any of the chat questions? You're muted, I think.
Sorry, I thought I'd unmuted. Just to say, I think Liz's suggestion about costing time away from the shop floor, as it were, looks like an interesting one. Maybe that's one we should pick up after the session. But I think building it into workloads for L&D within workload planning within you know, within hospitality looks like it might be a useful one to take forward.
Yeah, we're definitely, I mean, we've just extended the period for the second wave of managers to access the training in the pilot institution, mainly because it's Easter. Nobody's got any time and it's the busiest period. And you know, these are the realities of trying to do these things. Anybody else want to pick up? We've got 5 minutes left. Otherwise, I'm going to keep talking. Richard, no?
Jill's got another question. She just posted.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, Jill, we are, so I think we're still keen. If you think about the impacts that we're trying to identify, it's harder in, for instance, manufacturing contexts where you're going to find it harder to get bottom line, identify bottom line impacts. I think we're still, so for instance, we're talking to a company that is an insurance company, okay, which has indicators of customer satisfaction and things like that. So that's part, you know, so I think we can move out in, and definitely to get research engagement, we're going to loosen our criteria for which particular sectors. But I think there's still that idea that we need to be engaged, particularly with sectors that have a customer focus, so that we can capture impacts, hopefully relatively quickly. And also, yeah, I do, you know, that would value something that's relatively light touch. So yes, I think we will. Yeah, go ahead.
Can I just respond to there's a question and sort of a comment by C Rush. Sorry, I don't know what your first name is. About one-to-one or coaching, a better method to embed learning. And I think, so yeah, so in an ideal world, and this is one of the things I think we're grappling with, in an ideal world, it would be fabulous if every line manager had dedicated one-to-one coaching from a well-trained, more senior manager. That would be brilliant. The reality is that just isn't going to happen in relation to conflict management. It's not going to happen in the vast majority of workplaces, and we have a real problem. So I think the philosophy of what we're trying to do is trying to come up with something that doesn't turn every manager into a fantastic leader or, you know, a multi-skilled, multi-competency individual. It's about making managers a little bit better at what they do. And if they can be 10 or 15% better at managing issues, that's 10 or 15% reduction in the cost of conflict. And, you know, other work that we've done shows that that's really very extensive. So I completely agree with you. And what we're trying to do with the one-to-ones is that we're just trialing the idea of having a system, and it works really well. I mean, we have been doing it this week with managers, whereby, you know, they can be doing the training and they can book a 15-minute appointment with me online, go straight into my diary. I can then go through a situation, a scenario with them, 15 minutes, and just before they have a difficult conversation. One of the problems with face-to-face training is that, in our view, and from talking to people about this, is that people go on a course, they do their 1 day of training, they enjoy it, it's really interesting. And then the next time they have a difficult conversation is 2 months later, by which time they're desperately trying to sort of, you know, remember the things that were perhaps in the handbook that they were given in that training course. The reality is there's not that much follow-up, and this is a way of potentially providing some follow-up. I think in practical terms, what we're doing actually is a complement to some of those other more in-depth training approaches as well.
Yeah, definitely. Paul, do you want to add anything? Last points? Oh, Paul's frozen.
Just to say, I mean, Johnny's just plugged the CIPD evidence on effective virtual training. I was just going to type in an individual message to say we have very much a first draft working paper that talks about some of the beta testing, and it cites that very paper. It's an excellent read, so I'm happy to endorse that as a product, Johnny.
Yeah, we definitely don't mind you pushing your wares, Johnny. Okay, so just on that, you know, on a few of the bits that have come up in the chat and kind of thinking about other ways of delivering this, I think Richard's point about this being a complement to other kind of forms of intervention is very important, in that, you know, when you think of somebody who's in their mid-20s who's managing 3 people on a bar, the idea that they would have one-to-one coaching, you know, it's just, the company are just not going to pay for it in reality. So part of what we're doing is to try and develop something that could be very large scale, very light touch for groups of individuals who just don't tend to receive any kind of training in conflict resolution. So that's the idea. Okay, thanks very much, everybody, and hopefully you've enjoyed the session.